Let us begin right away by going to our topic, which is, of course, the Khmelnytsky uprising and Ashkenazi Jewry. This is part 5 of the lecture series regarding Ashkenaz. Here, I hope you can all see my screen all right. I want to begin with a short historical trigger alert because we're going to be speaking about some aspect of history which is, especially in the present moment, somewhat controversial and has actually been the source of a certain amount of grief for me personally, as I hope to explain. Let me begin by taking you into a little bit of a historiographic discussion, and then we'll focus in on the 17th century. So, introducing you here to three very important historical thinkers. On the left, you have Leopold von Ranke, who is one of the most important 19th century historians, whose approach to history was really very straightforward. A lot of people can appreciate it. He says that historians should really concentrate on, in his famous phrase, was es eigentlich gewesen war, what actually happened. Like, just try and drill down on getting just the facts, as they would say in common parlance. And that's, a little bit more complicated than many would think, as von Ranke would explain as well. Then in the middle of your screen, you have Julius Wellhausen, who was known more for his discussion of ancient Israel and biblical studies in particular. And I think one of the most contributions that he brings to our discussion and to historical scholarship in general is the notion that historical works are more about the period in which they are written than the period which they purport to describe. It's a very important concept in that, we have to understand that historians are people too, and historians work with a certain set of assumptions, a Weltanschauung, a way of looking at the world. And when they look at their data, they are participant observers in the overall arc of history. And so they interpret that historical data within the light of their appreciation of the human condition as a whole. And as we shall see, this is extremely relevant for today's topic. And then on the right, you have the incredible encyclopedic Jewish historian Salo Whitmire Baron of Columbia University, actually a native of Ukraine originally, who spoke about the present moment in particular for 20th century Jewish historians, and he criticized what had been known as or what he termed as the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Lachrymose meaning full of tears. Now, there's definitely a lot to cry about in Jewish history. Most of Baron's great work was written, for example, after the Holocaust, which we will discuss in a few lectures. And this was an incredible, colossal Jewish tragedy and world tragedy over which, there's tremendous amount of space for lament. However, Dr. Baron really emphasized that we should not reduce Jewish history to a cycle of books and pogroms, pogroms and books, meaning this kind of model that the Jews are extremely intellectually active, producing all these fantastic literary works that generate tremendous contributions for global culture, and then they are unfairly attacked in these horrible acts of violence, and then nevertheless they come back and they create more works of lasting literary value and so on. This kind of cycle of intellectual activity, unfair persecution, intellectual activity, and so on. There is merit to that understanding of Jewish history, but it is horribly reductionist, and it evades most of the sophistication that we really need to bring to bear to understand the much more complex dynamic of social factors, economic factors, religious factors, political factors that shape Jewish history as a whole. Now, if we take these three things together, if we try to understand was es eigentlich gewesen war in the 17th century, what actually happened in the Khmelnytsky rebellion, specifically with regards to the Ashkenazic Jews that are our subject of study for this series. If we understand that whatever we say today, whatever we research today, is, like Wellhausen would argue, trapped within our current historical moment, then what would Salo Baron say, or what would we opine he would say, if we were to look at our present moment and how do we fit that within what had become the dominant mode of Jewish scholarship, especially in the immediate post-Holocaust period, as we, are still recovering as we're still recovering as orphans of that great tragedy. And in particular, if we're talking about 2022, our current moment, of course, the most dramatic elements that are affecting our lives right now is the horrific conflict in Ukraine, in which Ukraine was attacked unprovoked by Russia, and the people of Ukraine are suffering tremendously with bombardment of civilian areas. They're digging slit trenches in Mariupol and places like that to be able to bury their dead. An estimated 10 million people displaced as a result of this war, and we see no immediate end in sight, with several million, by the way, of those displaced as refugees in neighboring countries. In many ways, this is a reflection of the 17th century conflict that we're going to study, although the players are going to be quite different. And in the middle of all of this, you have a heroic president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who right from the very beginning of the conflict elected to remain in the capital despite the multiple assassination attempts that were launched against him and the tremendous dangers to himself and his family. He chose to remain and in many ways energized the entire world to take action to defend the civilians of Ukraine, and he continues to behave in this manner to the present day. Zelensky, of course, is Jewish, and this is, somewhat ironic when one tries to place his current role within the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which tends to view our 17th century perspectives of Ukrainians and Jews within the model of books and pogroms, with emphasis really on the latter, pogroms, because the 17th century Khmelnytsky uprising is one in which there was phenomenal violence visited on the Jewish minority in Ukraine. It is a period in which Jews look back with tremendous sadness and anger as they reflect on the horrific descriptions of those pogroms and the terrible murders that occurred at that time at the hands of the Kozake, the Cossacks, who we will describe shortly. But if we are to try to understand this in a more sophisticated manner, we'll see that it's considerably more complicated than the lachrymose model would offer. And that's really what I hope to drill in today. Looking at this picture, I also reflect, interestingly, I think, that, Zelensky, by the way, here is holding his formal emergency application to join the European Union, which is, of course, a major contested issue within the conflict itself. Vladimir Putin of Russia wants to keep Ukraine neutral outside of the Western orbit, and Zelensky and many other Ukrainians see themselves as fundamentally European rather than within a Slavic Russian orbit specifically, or post-Soviet orbit. And look at the individual standing to his right, Ruslan Stefanchuk, who looks to me like my image of a Cossack that I think a lot of Jews would, I think, resonate that. He stands a full head taller than the Jewish President Zelensky, and he's quite a bit larger. And, that's kind of like my gut reaction to the history of the Cossack, as we shall see. Nevertheless, in this presumably deeply anti-Semitic country, looking at it from the lachrymose position, Zelensky could be elected with a 72% landslide in the recent elections, regardless of his Jewish origins. The same thing happened. He had a prime minister who was Jewish and so on. I mean, how does this fit together? That's going to be part of our discussion today. So here is the trigger warning, and then no more interruptions. Let's go straight to the history. In the context of this conflict, because I'm deeply, involved on a scholarly level with the history of Jews of Ukraine. My first area of research was the Jews of Ukraine during the revolutionary period. I published a book on that topic, my dissertation, and written a few other things, and traveled there many times to do research. I felt great sympathy for the civilians of Ukraine, and so I published a few videos on my website. And those were, thank God, very well received. Lots of people enjoyed learning about the history of the Jews of Ukraine, which was my small contribution to the overall effort to restore normalcy to that region of the world. But I was surprised by two types of hate that I received that were really quite intense. One was the remarkable number of Russian bots. I use that term in two senses. Bots in the sense of they're probably just automatic, negative comments because they say something somewhat positive about Ukraine. And bots also in the term of being purchased, because I saw a lot of people who were just completely sold on the ridiculous amount of Russian propaganda that somehow colors their understanding of this conflict. But the other group that really bothered me was I received a lot of negative comments from Jews who were deeply disturbed with the concept that there might be something redeeming, even partially, about the Ukrainian people. And they held on to what I would characterize really racist views, understanding in an essentialist manner that all Jews are always good and they never do anything wrong, and all Ukrainians are the opposite. I was very sorry to hear that, and I even received some personal emails from people with whom I had had a relationship for a very long time. And when I suggested that their views were actually racist, then I got such tremendous flack, and I think some friendships are irreparably damaged. But what we're going to look at today is a much more sophisticated period in which we will have to challenge that very rigid and self-affirming notion, both for Jews and for Ukrainians, and by the way, also Poles and so on. The history is far more complicated. If you are concerned about this and you are not prepared to have some of your presumptions challenged, I suggest that you stop watching this video right now. If you're on YouTube, type into the search bar cute puppy videos or kitten videos, and I'm sure you'll find things that are far more appealing. But if you are willing to continue with me as we look at this from a more sophisticated historical perspective, please do. So let us go straight to the history then. Sorry for that rather longish introduction. So as we discussed in the previous lectures in this series, the Ashkenazi population is based primarily in the Rhineland, and they're settled there from about the 9th century onward. And as we move through the next 5 centuries, there's a rather large swelling of anti-Semitic pressures that drives them to the east. These pressures are expressed in terms of economic competition, with money lending falling under increasing challenge. There are religious pressures, or anti-Semitic pressures that have roots in the religious conflict. You see the rise of the ridiculous blood libel that caused so much violence, the host desecration charges, and so on. And there are a number of expulsions as well. France expels the Jews several times in the 14th century, as we discussed. So there's like anti-Semitic pressures which are driving Jews out of the Rhineland. And at the same time, there's kind of an invitation, literally an invitation, I should say, an economic opportunity vacuum that opens up in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that draws many Jews into new settlements there. They're still living under the corporate structure that we described for the Rhineland, and they will set up similar communities with charters and privileges and so on, as we discussed. But it is going to take on a somewhat different character economically, as we shall see. Here is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at its greatest extent. This was a political union, really a dynastic union of the Lithuanians and the Poles that lasted for several hundred years. And as you can see, with the modern boundaries that are sort of overlaid on this Commonwealth, there's a massive political entity stretching from the Baltic Sea almost all the way down to the Black Sea and encompassing several modern European boundaries. Where Jews settled was in Poland and Lithuania and in parts of Belarus. And for our purposes, quite a few settled in this region of Ukraine known as Right Bank Ukraine. The term Right Bank refers to the Dnipro River, which more or less bisects Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory. And since it flows to the south, when you're watching it flow and you stand on the right-hand bank, that's why it's primarily Western Ukraine. How many Jews were living here on the eve of the Khmelnytsky Rebellion, which was in 1648? The most solid demographic analysis based on the sources that we have, some of which are actually quite accurate, tax records and things like that, is about 40,000 Jews living in the region. The most important pioneering research that I'm going to be relying on for much of this presentation is the work of Shaul Stamfer of Hebrew University. He's a senior scholar, very well respected, who's done a lot of work on Eastern Europe, and you may recall his name from our discussion of the Khazar hypothesis way back in the first lecture of this series. Here is another map that comes from Dr. Stamfer's work, and you can see much more clearly the specific locations where many Jews inhabited Right Bank Ukraine. So what exactly is going on with the Jewish communities there? What was the cause of the uprising and so on? Let us understand that the Jews actually continued their development in Right Bank Ukraine in a very, very positive manner, primarily through an institution which they called the Council of Lands, sometimes called the Council of Four Lands, the Vad Arba Aratzot, which essentially was, if you recall our discussion a little while ago, of the Kehillah structure. It was a remarkable federation of local Jewish municipalities that aimed to regulate Jewish life throughout the entirety of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was primitive by modern standards, but by early modern and certainly by medieval standards, it was a huge leap forward, and it allowed the Jews who were a non-territorial minority, meaning they did not inhabit a single contiguous territory where they were the dominant population. They were always a minority wherever they lived. Nevertheless, they were able to regulate their own affairs through Talmudic law and interpreted by rabbis in consonance with Talmudic law throughout the entirety of the state. Most of the activity of the Council of Lands was primarily with regards economic activity, for example, things like protecting copyright, trying to impose social legislation that would have beneficial economic implications. Like, for example, the Council of Lands had a lot of sumptuary legislation, which basically talks about the limits on how much Jews may spend on their social activities. Like if you have, literally, if you have a wedding, you can only invite so many guests, you can only serve so many kinds of food. The idea being that since Jews are a gregarious people and there is a natural kind of human desire to outdo one another and make a bigger party, a bigger simcha than someone else, that would have deleterious impact on people's home finances. So they were trying to tamp that down with sumptuary legislation. This is something, by the way, that happens in the present day as well. And also, of course, enforcing aspects of social activities, like if a husband were, for example, to be estranged from his wife but refuse to give her a get, a bill of divorce, which has tremendous consequences. The wife cannot remarry under such circumstances. The husband also cannot remarry, but there are loopholes that make it, it's not for our discussion today, but make it a little bit more easy for him to nevertheless continue with his life. If he moves from one town to another, then the Council of Lands would be able to track him and to report to the town that he comes to that he should suffer ostracism and so on for what he failed to do or did in some other town. So the Council of Lands was actually a remarkable, almost a state within a state for this minority. Many historians, like Shimon Dubno in particular, looked at it as really a high point, as an ideal of Jewish self-government in the period. So in many ways, Jews had a remarkably safe and comfortable existence in the regions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including Ukraine, so much so that they used to refer to the land of Poland, in Yiddish, Polin, as a place where they would rest, which is actually what the word means in Hebrew. Polin means here we will rest. That finally, after the persecutions that they had endured in Western Europe, many Jews felt that Poland was this paradise for them. Poland writ large, meaning the entire region, including the Ukrainian area that was dominated by the Poles. And so for a certain period of time, some centuries really, Jews actually enjoyed their existence in Poland tremendously. The Khmelnytsky Rebellion would be a dramatic turnaround for them, a period of phenomenal persecution and upheaval and disruption that would color their memory of Poland for centuries to come. Let's look at the economic status of Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which will be extremely important for understanding the basis of the uprising. Here is a remarkable early 20th century representation of a typical Ukrainian krechma, an inn, which was an institution that was actually dominated by Jews for a very pragmatic economic reason. Let us recall that in Ukraine, for most of its history, really up until the 20th century, the vast majority of the population were agrarian, living in the very rich farmlands, the black soil chernozem of the region, but Jews tended to live in the small villages where they tended to provide a whole variety of commercial services. To a certain degree, small money lending, definitely not nearly at the scope that we saw earlier in the medieval period in Ashkenaz. Lots of commerce, lots of small trade, like in spoons and forks and simple things like that. But one of the areas in which there was a certain popular demand was in the distillation and sale of alcohol. So let us understand what's going on in Ukraine in particular. The region was multi-ethnic. The vast majority of the population were basically Ukrainian farmers. Ukrainians are a Slavic people. Religiously, they are predominantly Orthodox in rite, although to the west of Ukraine, a uniate church was formed in which they kept the Orthodox rite, but they owed allegiance to the Pope in Rome, a Catholic hierarchy. This is particularly in the region of Halychina, Galicia, East Galicia in particular. Towns of Lviv, for example, are right in the heart of that Eastern Catholic region, whereas most Ukrainians were actually Orthodox. This will actually play into our discussion here. They were, however, basically landed serfs, and they were literally owned in that capacity by Polish landlords who largely lived far away to the north, in Poland in particular. The Polish landlords would own these huge tracts of lands called latifundia, and they would be the ones who would derive most of the profit from these lands. Now, the difficult aspect for the Poles was, how do they manage these massive latifundia upon which many Ukrainians are essentially working the land? That's where the Jews come in. So the Jews are migrating to this region, and they are receiving charters from Polish noblemen and Polish kings to be involved in various activities. Some of the earliest activities involved their role as minters, meaning they're actually literally making money, like making coins. Some of the earliest coins that we have from Poland are actually written in Hebrew characters, referring to King Meshko and things like that. Rather remarkable, because the Jews brought with them a lot of economic expertise that they had developed in Western Europe. Jews were overwhelmingly literate, they were numerate, they tended to live in villages and towns, so they were engaged much more in kind of like information work and things that involved the mind as opposed to the back. Very few of them were involved in actually dealing with agriculture. They're much more involved in more urban types of economic activity. One of those was the distillation and sale of alcohol, which was frequently given to Jewish communities as an exclusive right called propinatia. So this is something that the Polish noblemen would grant to the Jews and give them the exclusive right to do so, the monopoly to do so, because then the Polish noblemen could tax that activity much more effectively. And they banned the production of moonshine, samahon, things like that, rather directing it through Jewish auspices, which were frequently conducted in these taverns, these inns, as you see in this particular picture here, where you have, very, typical types of activity. There's a Jew standing behind the bar who is, pouring a drink of vodka. You have another Jew involved in music, also very classic Jewish occupation. And then you have well-dressed Ukrainians who are coming to enjoy the environment of the tavern. Now, this becomes especially problematic for reasons that I'm going to describe right now. I described how the Ukrainians are living primarily on these big latifundia. There is, of course, a much smaller Ukrainian urban class that is literate and that is numerate and so on. This is a professional class, but it is really a small slice of the population. Overwhelmingly, they are agrarianists, agriculturalists. The Jews are brought in not only to engage in propinatia, as shown in this image, or as klezmer musicians, but they are brought in to be middlemen. They're brought in by the Poles to manage these large estates and to collect the income, which is then taxed by the noblemen. And this was done through a system called the arenda. The practitioners were called arrendators, and it's really basically something which is called in Western Europe tax farming, and it goes basically like this. You'll recall how we discussed this sort of feudal aspect of Jewish structure, of really social structure in general, that people were grouped into their caste-like classes, like peasants as a whole, noblemen as a whole, and Jews had their own little box as well. Rather than being addressed as individuals, they are dealt with as a community. So the noblemen who literally owned the entire town, the not only the fields and, in a technical sense, the serfs who worked them, but also the buildings, the uh, the flour mill, the church, all kinds of properties were actually owned by the noblemen, and the nobleman would essentially say to the Jews, "Listen, I don't want to live way out in right bank Ukraine. I want to live here in Warsaw, where I have a lot of my other Polish noble friends, and so I'm hiring you to act as my arrendators, my tax farmers, and I expect you to collect from these properties X amount of money, let's say 10,000 zloty. I expect you to collect over the next year 10,000 zloty from my latifundia." And this would be something that could be delivered as a demand to the entire community. They would have a representative of the kahal, the kahila, who would be negotiating with the noblemen, the porets, and the nobleman would say, "Okay, I want 10,000 zloty from the territory. You can collect it any way you want. If necessary, I will back you up with my armed forces, but that's what you have to do." So the Jews would say, "All right, fine, we'll negotiate that amount, 10,000." They would go back, and then they would have to find the way to collect 10,000 from the Ukrainian peasants. Obviously, a large portion of that would be in terms of agricultural output, in terms of grain. Um, but they could collect it in all kinds of other ways. For example, by imposing tolls on transit, crossing bridges, traveling highways. They could impose taxes on hunting in particular regions, taxes on, collecting fruit in orchards, taxes on using the nobleman's flour mill. Whatever creative ways they could tax the population was essentially something that the nobleman would encourage, so long as it was something that could be borne by the population as a whole. In some really notorious cases, which receive a lot of emphasis in the Ukrainian folk songs called Dume, the Jews apparently even owned the keys to the churches. There's some debate about certainly the extent of this practice, but nevertheless the perception of it was very well known. And that if a Ukrainian wanted to baptize a child, celebrate a wedding, whatever things you might need the church for, they would have to pay a tax to the Jewish arrendator in order to release the key to the church. Now you can imagine that this must have been a very difficult system to exist under for all parties, really. For the Poles, who are, according to many accounts, living an increasingly conspicuous consumption lifestyle where they're enjoying many Western fashions and trying to keep up with what is the latest style in Paris. They're going to be demanding ever more taxes every year. This is just, I think, a reality of life that when you can charge more, you will. The Ukrainians have to deal with a greater debt load, and the Jews, who are the tax collectors essentially, have the difficult situation of trying to exact that amount from the local population and then transmit it to the nobleman. And by the way, I should mention one fact about tax farming. The Jews have to be paid as well for their services, and the way they are paid is whatever above and beyond they are able to collect in taxes, that's what they can keep for themselves. So if the community, and this would involve a large number of people who are engaged in various forms of tax farming, if the community is supposed to transmit 10,000 zloty, and then they will strive to collect 12,000 zloty, and 2,000 of that would be preserved for the community as a whole. The arenda, in other words, was an exploitative economic system that was directed by the whims of the noblemen in Poland, but the Jews were the front-facing aspect of the entire enterprise, and a very difficult one it must have been. Shimon Dubno described this as being caught between hammer and anvil, which I think is a very apt metaphor. The hammer being, of course, the Polish demand, the anvil being the Ukrainian peasantry, and the Jews are sitting in this very difficult situation. Now, what ends up happening is there will be a massive peasant revolt in the middle of the 17th century. And that peasant revolt will be directed against three main targets. The rebellion was led by a man named Bohdan Khmelnytsky. You can see here that his followers were the so-called Kozake, or Cossacks. Who were these Cossacks? Cossacks, or Kozake, to use the Ukrainian pronunciation, were basically Ukrainian peasants who had, for one reason or another, abandoned their traditional lands and had migrated to places where they were out of reach of the Polish latifundia. Since they, as serfs, were technically owned by the noblemen, and their refusal to labor under this system was a type of rebellion, they were essentially a type of outlaws, and they engaged in a variety of freebooting and banditry-like activities. Some of them were directed at the Turks nearby, who were engaged in child trafficking. Slavery was still a well-known enterprise in the 17th century, and the kidnapping of children and then their sale on the market was something that was obviously hated by all, and the Kozake were involved in sometimes attacking these Turkish settlements on the Black Sea coastline. But they're also involved in attacks on the Polish nobility. Let us understand that the three principal enemies of the Kozake were the Polish noblemen far away in Poland, who were demanding so much of the peasantry, the Jews, who were their local representatives, their middlemen, and also the Catholics, specifically and in particular those Ukrainians in the Western region who had adopted this new Uniate Church affiliation, to some degree under Polish pressure, who were looked at the conversion of some of these Orthodox Ukrainians as a way of weaning them away from that cultural orientation, which was antagonistic to their way of thinking of dominating the entire population. And so what happened is this individual, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who was one of the minor Ukrainian noblemen, he gathered around him a large number of followers from regions like the Zaporizhian Sich, which was one of the major locations where Kozake were living, and he led them on a massive series of attacks against these Polish noblemen. The attacks, of course, had to make their way through right bank Ukraine up towards Poland in order to achieve their objective, and they actually ultimately achieved their objective, created their own state at the time. But of course, on the way, they are wreaking tremendous havoc against Jewish communities. This became what was known as, in Hebrew, the Gezerat Tachbetat, the decree of 1648-49, which was an absolutely horrific period of awful pogroms, which are recorded in a series of chronicles from the era, including most famously Nathan of Hanover's Abyss of Despair, Yeven Metzulah, which was a terrible, highly evocative description of these pogroms, these attacks on local Jewish populations, which are described in such emotive and powerful language. And this was a period of tremendous Ukrainian violence directed against the Jewish population. But surprisingly, most people who have a passing familiarity with Ukrainian history will, look to this period as one of great devastation and of a great anti-Semitic activity. But if you actually read Nathan of Hanover, you'll see that he describes much of the uprising as a reaction to the economic conditions under which Ukrainians were living. In other words, he hardly soft pedals the anti-Semitic attacks on Jews. In fact, his descriptions, the detailed, grisly descriptions of the violence, are really heartrending. But he also, applies blame to the Jews who were engaged in exploitative economic practices, which Nathan of Hanover argues was a major cause of Ukrainian dissent to begin with. And let us recall that Jews are living in Ukraine by this time, certainly since the 13th and 14th century. So they've been there largely living in peace for 200-300 years before this uprising occurred. There would be more of these uprisings in the future, including the 1768 Haidamach uprising, which was similar in nature, and massacres in Uman, where Nachman of Bratslav would later choose to be buried because he wanted to be close to those Jews who were killed in similar uprisings. And it would become a trope in Ukrainian Jewish history of Ukrainian violence directed against Jews. But if you look at it from the perspective of the chroniclers, although they clearly have an interest in describing the pogroms with a tremendous amount of emotive value, they're similarly still discussing the economic roots of this particular uprising. Now, what about how many Jews died in this uprising led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky? If you recall Salvo Baron's depiction of the lachrymose view of Jewish history, and particularly when you're viewing Jewish history from a post-Holocaust perspective, one tends to see an inflation of numbers beyond what is logically possible for Ukraine. The number 100,000 dead is frequently used by not only 17th, 18th century commentators, but even by 19th, 20th century historians. And it's largely based on sloppy scholarship. First of all, the 17th century commentators had no way of actually calculating the demographic numbers. They simply didn't have the tools at their disposal to actually figure out how many people were even living there to begin with. And later on, you see this 100,000 number, balloon to sometimes 250 and even 500,000 dead. Now, none of this is possible because, as Dr. Stampfer has clearly demonstrated, there are only 40,000 Jews living in Right Bank Ukraine by 1648. How is it possible that you could have multiple times that number killed in this terrible uprising? Furthermore, as Dr. Stampfer demonstrates, after 1648-49, when the situation begins to calm down again, the Jewish communities begin to bounce back fairly quickly. Tax returns, tax receipts indicate that the population has begun to stabilize within a very short period of time. So, taking these numbers all together and working town by town with the best data we have, Dr. Stampfer emphasizes that even if we look at 50% of the Jews being killed, which he thinks is kind of an outside number, 50% of a population is a huge loss. It's far worse than the Black Death, for example, in most areas, and it's hard to even imagine half of a population being wiped out in this manner. But nevertheless, that's still only about 18 or 20,000 dead. Now, how can I even say only 18 or 20,000 dead? That's a horrific number. I'm only saying it, though, to contrast with the hyperbolic numbers of 100,000 or 250 or 500,000 that really make no sense. This is In other words, a period of tremendous anti-Semitic violence, largely of an economic character, but it does not reach the same levels that we would have later, and it cannot be compared in any way to the Holocaust in terms of its genocidal intent. So, if you recall my introductory words, this is a period in which, we definitely look Ukrainian anti-Semitism in the eye. This is a period of tremendous violence against Jews, but we also have to understand some of the economic background of that violence, and that's often difficult for historians of, well, this period. Let us go to the aftermath, because in many ways, the issue of the Khmelnytsky uprising continues to reverberate in Ukrainian Jewish history. This is a 5 hryvnia note from contemporary Ukraine, and as you can see, it features Bohdan Khmelnytsky on it. And this should not be surprising for anyone who has even a passing familiarity with contemporary Ukrainian culture. Bohdan Khmelnytsky is widely regarded as a major Ukrainian hero. This is because on a surface level, he was able to wrest Ukraine from Polish control and for a brief time actually create an independent state of Ukraine in the middle of the 17th century. The Cossack state was, of course, supported by these freebooting cowboy-like individuals called the Kozake, and so Cossacks as a whole are kind of like a major heroic image in the Ukrainian mind. Jews, of course, look at Bohdan Khmelnytsky with fear, trepidation, and revulsion. I remember in my first trip to Ukraine, when I first met someone who was dressed, and this happens in contemporary Ukraine, he was dressed in contemporary Ukrainian costume with the traditional walrus mustache and, the embroidered shirt and things like that. I felt real fear. I said, oh my gosh, a Cossack. But for Ukrainians, they look at a Cossack and they say, oh, that's our, Marlboro man. That's our hero. There is a clash of perspectives on this 18th century, largely because both Jews and Ukrainians look at this same event from very, very different perspectives. Now, it's not uniform. But before I explain that, let me also illustrate this by showing you one of the most famous monuments in Kyiv today is a statue of Khmelnytsky. And he is famously pointing off, it's just behind his shoulder, he's famously pointing off to the north. And one of the reasons for this is because after a short while of independence, Bohdan Khmelnytsky decided to orient the Cossack state to Moscow. Rather than, creating a peace treaty with Poland and recreating something like either independence within a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or even just a peace treaty with an independent Ukraine, he chose to sort of shift the balance of power towards Moscow. And ultimately, that would degrade the independence of the Ukrainians to a dramatic degree in which they would be absorbed within the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire. By the way, here is an earlier version of that statue, a bronze model, which had a couple of details that were not included because they were felt to be in poor taste. But among the figures at the bottom of the statue are some Jews and others, Poles, who were downtrodden literally by Khmelnytsky's horse. They felt that was just a little bit too graphic for the image. And you see it also, for example, in the Ukrainian national anthem. Here it is. It's got this interesting beginning, Ще не вмерла Україна. Ukraine is not yet dead, which may sound jarring to the Western ear. Here, they translate it here as, nay, thou art not dead, Ukraine. A little bit of a kind of a poetic translation, I say, but literally, Ukraine is not dead yet is what it begins with. The Poles have a similar kind of refrain, and even the Jews in Hatikva, we had Od lo avda tikvatenu, right? Our hope is not yet lost. So that's not an uncommon trope during the national uprising. But a look at the very end of the national anthem, which refers to Ukrainian as Bratia Kozackohu Rodu. How they translate it? Okay, it literally is translated as brothers, the Cossack people. They've translated here poetically as ourselves, proud Cossacks are. The literal translation is literally, we're all Cossack brothers. I don't know how many Jews actually feel like Cossack brothers. That seems so foreign to them, but they're not alone. Here are the original lyrics of the poem that inspired the national anthem. And if you look at the last stanza that I've shown here, there's actually another stanza that I didn't squeeze on. There's this lament, Oy Bohdane, Bohdane. O Bohdan, Bohdan, our great hetman, what for did you give Ukraine to the wretched Moskals? Meaning, why did you give us to Moscow? Why did you forfeit our sovereignty for the Russians? There is a strong thread among many intellectuals in the 18th, 19th century and later, including, some very, very harsh words from their great poet Taras Shevchenko, regarding this decision of Khmelnytsky to orient Ukraine to Moscow. So it's a complex story altogether, from the perspective of Ukrainians, from the perspective of Jews, and from global perspective as we meditate upon this 17th century in the 21st. Thank you very much for your endurance. Have a good day.